morning and welcome, and thanks for the introductions. So I'm a practicing clinician. The past 25 years I've been looking after psoriasis and other dermatological conditions, but also been involved in clinical trials, genomics research. And so I'll give you 25 years of my career in about 8 minutes. Just a little bit of background for those who are really old in the audience. These are, anybody recognize these red cell rosettes? When you're looking at, when we first described HLA, and most people know what HLA is, this is how we identified, and now we do a genomics base. And we started our research on HLA-CW6. That's what we were using. My talk is on genomics and big pharma, and the message is big pharma should listen to researchers and should listen to clinicians. And throughout my talk, I'll give you a number of examples where they didn't, and some of them died by the sword because they didn't listen to us. And really good products that patients still ask for are gone because they didn't listen to the little guy. I'm going to talk about a gene called HLA-CW6, and it's really the quintessential psoriasis gene, and it's linked to early age of onset, decreased longevity, cardiovascular risk, and response to biologic therapy. And it's also a target. So here we identified a gene. This gene has been known since 1980, but we did some work, and I'll show you that data. But this gene now is not only associated with the disease, but it goes the full spectrum. You can predict the natural history of the disease. You can tell who's going to respond to the drugs. And if you target it, you can likely treat the disease. And again, there's really in no other disease state do we know so much about a gene linked to a specific disease. And not only that, there's evolutionary evidence of why this gene is important in psoriasis, and I'll share a little bit of that with you. All right, so that's the introduction. So this is my psoriasis journey, which began in 1986 as a resident at McGill. And this patient here, who I looked after, had very bad psoriasis, in and out of hospital, had arthritis, died early of cardiovascular disease. And that was the plight of the psoriasis patient. You got psoriasis when you're 15, you died when you were 50 or 55, you had bad arthritis, and you had a really lousy life. Now, I met this young man when I came back in '89. Very severe psoriasis, as you can see, about 30–40% of his body covered. And with the tools I had, methotrexate and cyclosporin, I was able to keep his skin clear, keep him working and functioning. But look what's happened to his joints. His joints have been destroyed because I had no good drugs to treat his arthritis. I could not prevent the destruction of his joints with psoriatic arthritis. And then you meet this guy here. And this fellow walked into my office with 20% of his body surface area covered in psoriasis, 20 swollen and tender joints. His nails were falling off. And within about 3 months, we had him 100% clear. And then by July that year, he caught the biggest salmon on our trip. This is my younger brother, Joe, who, and the salmon, we have to conceal the identity so that, the innocent are protected. But this 21-pound salmon he caught, it was the biggest salmon on the trip. It beat out my father and myself. And so Joe was part of psoriasis genetics in Newfoundland. And so I have 6 sisters. 2 of them have psoriasis. I have 3 brothers. 1 has psoriasis. Aunts, uncles, cousins. And the psoriasis in Newfoundland is there for a reason. The reason it's there, it's a survival advantage because we had a lot of tuberculosis. And if you have psoriasis, and I'll show you the biochemistry, you produce a lot of TNF. And TNF is the protein our body uses to prevent tuberculosis from killing us and preventing a lot of other nasty infections. So when you put genetics, evolution, and everything together, we know why we have so much psoriasis. And it's better to live till you're 15 and get psoriasis and die in infancy of TB. And so that's the psoriasis journey. But I'll bring it back and show you a little bit about the genetics as well. Again, in terms of genetics, there was a lot of hype about that. We talked about the genomics hype back in the 80s and the 90s. And, we had discovered this. In most jurisdictions, 30% of patients had a family history of psoriasis. In Newfoundland and Labrador, it was 90%. So we knew it was genetic-driven disease. And this was me a lot younger, and this is the front page of the Globe and Mail. And then the genes of psoriasis have been identified, and back in the 1980s, there's one. I'm going to fill in this blank here because we were working with industry, so some of our data didn't make it to the public domain, but a lot of it did. But again, there were 3 genes that were suggested, HLA, CW6, and then IL-12 and 23. And then now, 2010, there were about 20, and now we're up to around 38. And the thing about it is that many of these genes are druggable targets. So there's a drug called ustekinumab or Stelara that actually targets IL-12, 23, works very well in psoriasis. The TNF genes here, these again linked to psoriasis and druggable targets, and I'll share some of that data with you, and many more. So this is our initial data showing that psoriasis was linked to early age of onset. And then you talk about innovations of biochemistry, and we heard about 3 billion. When we did this study back in the mid-90s, we had 1,000 patients, but we had 300 genetic markers, and now you have 2.5 million, and we were able to identify 2 genes. So at this point, we knew that TNF-alpha would work in psoriasis because it's linked, and we believe that's CW6. And the p-values here are reasonable, 10 to the minus 3, but look at CW6. 10 to the minus 12. So there's no doubt in our mind this gene is linked to this disease. And then we looked at all of the drugs that were in development, and this slide is probably 15 years old, but all the anti-TNFs, they actually do target a gene that's also in the HLA region, infliximab and etanercept, huge innovations. We have this molecule that we were developing, but there are other molecules that came to the market. Alefacet, one of our first biologics, worked reasonably well, but targeted a gene in source 4. And then eculizumab. And eculizumab is a wonderful story of a drug that worked reasonably well in psoriasis, but because the company didn't want to pigeonhole themselves in treating 60% of the people with the most severe disease, they ended up losing the product. So this is where the 25 years comes around. So I'm just going to talk a little science, and antimicrobial peptides are part of our innate immunity, and then we have acquired immunity. And what happens is that we have proteins on our skin that protect us from infections and a few other nasty things, but they can also drive our immune system. This paper in 2014 from my friend Antonio Costantino's in Italy suggests that LL33, which is an antimicrobial peptide, triggers psoriasis. And how it does it is that you get injury, so you get release of this, also some DNA and RNA coming out, and that's taken up by other skin cells or keratinocytes. HLA presents this to immune cells, like this CD8 and this dendritic cell, and that drives the cytokines like TNF, IL-12, and 23, and then the rest is history, because now we're targeting these cytokines and treating psoriasis. And this is actually HLA-C sitting right here, and so what happens is the antimicrobial peptide will sit in here, and then it will enhance the immune response. You'll produce TNF-alpha. Now, if you have the psoriasis predisposition, you develop psoriasis. But back if you were, the days when we had in Newfoundland 80% of some communities with latent TB and other communities with 60% with active TB, it was a survival advantage. Whereas now you end up with psoriasis. And so here we see HLA-CW6. So this is work out of our lab and our collaboration where we actually looked at CW6. These are the killer immunoglobulin-like receptors that interact. And this is where the LL37 would sit, and then we developed a small peptide that would block this interaction, thus preventing the downstream effects and preventing psoriasis. So we all heard from our friend Ronnie about how important personalized medicine is. And so really, I actually test HLA-CW6 for my patients because and I'll show you the data why it's so important. Now, in Newfoundland and Labrador, they're not only going to be going in asking for their sequence, but now our pharmacists have been able to be given the ability to prescribe and diagnose. They have 14 conditions, of which 10 of them are skin conditions. So the recent cartoon in the local paper was the patient goes into the pharmacist and says, I got 2 problems, buddy. He says, I got a problem with me hemorrhoids and I got a problem with me nose. And the pharmacist says, well, the nose is $20 and the hemorrhoids are 10. He says, I think I'll take the hemorrhoids today because I only got $10 in my pocket. And so as we move forward, the pharmacist will be playing a bigger role in the diagnosis and the management, but it's also very important because in drugs like Imuran, before the pharmacist can prescribe it, we need a test called TPMT. So as we interact with our pharmacists, it'll be across a number of different aspects. So here's my sequence. I'm CW6 positive. What does that mean in my life? Well, if you're CW6 positive, it's more frequent in patients with psoriatic arthritis. It's usually milder, later onset, earlier onset, linked to remission in pregnancy. So if you are a young woman, you have psoriasis, I do your CW6 level because I can tell you there's a 70% chance your psoriasis is going to get better during pregnancy. And in 2007, we showed that it actually, CW6 predicted response to eculizumab and infliximab. And infliximab was taken off the market because of 2 cases of a brain infection called PML, and that would have changed the risk-benefit profile from 1 in 15,000 to 1 in 45,000. And so this drug, which was being prescribed to tens of thousands of patients, was gone. Recently, we've shown, again, with our friends in Italy, that also it predicts response to ustekinumab in about 75%. So again, this gene has a great role to play. It's also, we know that CW6 is linked to early age of onset, and if your psoriasis starts before the age of 25, you die 10 to 20 years earlier. So it actually predicts mortality. And our last set of data showed that if you have psoriasis, then you're more likely to have a heart attack if you're male, if you get a bit older, but if your psoriasis starts before the age of 25, your risk of an MI is 9-fold or 900% increased. So by doing a history and a genetic test, and recently we had a patient asymptomatic, psoriasis started when he was 19, we sent him to the cardiologist, no symptoms, stress test, 3 blockages between 70 and 100%, bypass surgery, and living. The consequence was probably death within 3 months. So in conclusion, it's the same it was 1995 as it is in 2005, 2015. 2020 is that genomics-based medicine will not only help find new therapeutic targets, but will predict response and will elucidate the natural history of psoriasis and related comorbidities. And this is not going to only happen in psoriasis, which is a very good example, but we see it in the development of new drugs for cancer therapies. They find genes linked to cancers, they target those. Melanoma is a great example, breast cancer. So we see these innovations coming down the road, and these innovations not only better outcomes, but they lead to less cost. Do we have my questions? We have time for the questions, so we'll move forward. Thank you very much, and I look forward to any comments or questions.